Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Raj Patel, a global food policy specialist and the author of Stuffed and Starved. Welcome, Mr. Patel.
Good to be here, John.
How are you? Tell us a little bit about your general area of interest. How did you come into being a food policy expert? Was this something you set out to do?
No, I've always been interested in globalization. And that in some ways by birth. I mean, I was born in Britain. My mother was born in Kenya. My father was born in Fiji, and this is the result of a long period of globalization, or what used to be called imperialism. I've always been interested in understanding where things come from, and the origins of stuff, and the origins of why the world looks the way it does. Excuse me. So food came to be interesting because I was interested in the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and poverty in developing countries, and food became a way of talking to people in this country about not only how things happened in developing countries, but also a way of saying, well, actually, if you think strange things are happening in developing countries, they're also happening here. And you may have noticed that the obesity levels in the United States are rising, but you may also have noticed that levels of hunger are rising. And there are reasons why those are happening at the same time here in the United States and in developing countries. And those reasons are very similar. And so food becomes a sort of pedagogical tool, a way of saying, hey, this is a great tool for understanding how the world economy works.
So did you start your study here in the United States, or was it another country that first captivated your interest in the context of food policy?
Well, in the context of food policy, really, my interest was piqued here in the United States, but not in a way that one might think. I was one of the organizers, one of the thousands of organizers, at the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999. There were a lot of people there, and a lot of people exercised about the way that the World Trade System looked and the injustices that it perpetrated. But there was a group there that was promoting a different kind of globalization, and it was a group of peasants, of farmers, of farm workers, of people who didn't have land but wanted to be able to grow food. And that group, called La Via Campesina, which means the peasant way, well, they came from all around the world. There are about 150 million of these farmers and farm workers, including farmers right here in Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the National Family Farm Coalition. So, a lot of farmers, even in the United States, were pushing a kind of globalization that wasn't about open borders and giving large corporations a great deal of power, but really about exchange, about making markets work for people. And seeing people at the WTO with a very positive agenda was very inspiring to me. And so that's what sort of sparked the interest in food, and it's something I've sort of followed ever since.
So before you got into this issue area, what was your perspective on food and food policy? Was it something you didn't think a whole lot about?
It was. I mean, it's funny. I grew up in a convenience store in London. Right, my parents sold everything that I protest against. My diet really was, sort of potato chips and sugary drinks and sort of just hard candy. And I absolutely didn't think about it. And although I knew that there were certain things that one didn't eat, and when I was 15, I decided I didn't want to eat meat. In terms of the bigger political story, it was floating around in the back of my mind. But it was really the actual political moment of coming into contact with peasants and farm workers who had really far more theoretically sophisticated and politically sophisticated ideas than I'd really heard from anyone in the global justice movement. And certainly, I was in grad school at the time and studying the highfalutin theories that we learn in grad school, and hearing from peasants and farmers who were practically illiterate, hearing from them a very reasoned critique of the World Trade Organization, because in fact the documents had been translated into their language in 1992, way before anyone in the United States had ever heard of the World Trade Organization. To hear from them this really incredibly sophisticated argument around political economy really blew my mind. And so, and it shamed me that here's a dirt poor farmer who's had 3 years of school and works in a field and understands much better what the World Trade Organization is than me. And I'm meant to be studying this stuff. I mean, it was a humbling moment, but it was also an eye-opening moment in terms of, well, why does he get that? Why does he get it so well? I mean, obviously there's a vested interest, but there's also a fact that he's smart as a whip, and there's an analysis that he has that I'm not hearing anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Was there then a particular catalyst once you had developed awareness? Was there an event or some other development that caused you to get into this issue full time?
Sort of. I mean, I was doing my my doctoral work in Zimbabwe, and so in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was in Harare doing research, but also getting involved in political activism. And the trouble was that political activism took a particular stance against President Mugabe that the president seemed not to take a shine to. So I was kicked out of the country before I could finish my research, which meant that I needed to finish my dissertation and get a job in a hurry. And it just so happened that one of the groups that I'd been following was hiring. And that group was called Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy. It's a group that started really 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, when Francis Moore Lepay wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet. And they've been doing a lot of work on the root causes of food and hunger, of hunger and of injustice around food. And so they were hiring, I applied, I got the job, and it was really that got me on the road to thinking about food. So I have Robert Mugabe to thank for my career as a food analyst.
So what is your basic critique of the world food system for the benefit of the audience that may not follow this?
Well, I mean, the critique, one doesn't need to go overseas to see what's wrong. We can look here in the United States. In the US, we have a system where really 4 out of 10 Americans has a normal body weight, and the rest are either overweight or obese. At the same time, this is really one of the freest food markets in the world, and you can buy whatever you like. And you go outside, you can buy dozens of different kinds of cereal and weird blue foods. In terms of a free market, this market is freer than anywhere else. And the trouble is that in this free market, 50 million Americans went hungry in 2008. And that's a problem, right? I mean, right here we have obesity, absolutely what seems to be free choice, and hunger. And sometimes that hunger is pretty serious. I mean, there's studies in New York where I believe one in 2 children in New York depends on food aid in one way or another. That's not a good outcome with the US food system. And so for me, the problem is that food is something that we need in order to survive. Markets are great things, and I like markets, and I'm keen to see them flourish. But distributing food through a market is a tremendously bad way of ensuring that everyone gets to eat. So my problem with the world food system is that we've given so much of it away to for-profit corporations that we've now entered into a situation where, on the one hand, the very poor don't get to eat, and then for the majority of people, the kinds of food that we are sold and marketed are food that's bad for us. There's an opportunity cost. Economists have this idea of opportunity cost of, well, what could have happened instead? And instead of the food system we have now, we could have a food system that provides not only better nutrition for all Americans and everyone around the world, but also works more sustainably. Because right now we need 2,000 liters of oil per American for the amount of food that we consume for the fertilizer, for the irrigation, for the transport. Where's that oil going to come from in the future when we run out? So we need to move to a more efficient way of farming, and big ag doesn't want that to happen. And that's my critique of the food system is that big ag owns the food system in a way. Big ag, is big agriculture, and the big agricultural corporations that really receive millions of dollars a year in subsidy from the U.S. government. And what I would like instead is for poor people to be allowed to eat rather than big corporations getting welfare.
Mm-hmm. Now, how much of this problem can be addressed by people in communities who opt to grow their own, or to take other steps that make food available that is presumably safer and better for consumers?
Well, I mean, I think that there's something very exciting about the local food movement. It's been very interesting, again, to watch this in the United States. I mean, when I came here, really in the late 90s, I left Europe, and everyone was here like, you're going to go to the United States, and you're going to put on weight, and you're going to be with the fatties. To some extent, it was true. I actually did put on weight pretty much as soon as I got off the plane. But the interesting thing is that the food movement in the United States over the past decade has been a revelation. And now people in Europe look to the United States food movement, looking at the way local food works, the way that policy is talked about. It's far more sophisticated than it is in Europe and in other parts of the world. So I think that there are interesting things happening, particularly at the local level. But for me, local food is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. I mean, yes, it's important that we grow food locally and that we eat with the seasons and we consume it with a footprint that's much smaller than we have with the way we consume now. But that's not going to guarantee that, for example, poor people get to eat. I mean, if you eat local, that doesn't necessarily address the issue of poverty. We also need to be thinking about how poverty prevents people from eating locally or eating at all. And we also need to be thinking, particularly in this country, about our longer historical responsibility in the way that we've shaped the food system in other countries. I say we because I became a U.S. citizen recently, so you are now a fellow American. And I feel like actually this government has done some pretty bad things in taking away choices for people in other parts of the world. We need to own up to that, and we need to make restitution for the damage that we have caused. And sometimes when you hear about local food, what gets forgotten is the fact, firstly, that poor don't get to eat in local areas, but secondly, that there is an international component even to the most local of food systems. And we need to be thinking internationally, even if we like to sort of focus our attention on what's happening right here. The local is never just local anymore, it's always international.
Is there anything that's happening at the federal level in the United States that you would consider encouraging? And then beyond that, what recommendations would you offer to the current administration about steps the United States might take to improve the world food system?
Well, it sounds flippant to sort of talk about Michelle Obama's, organic garden and her initiatives to sort of combat obesity. But interestingly, for me, I was listening to the State of the Union speech earlier this year, and all the initiatives that Michelle Obama was interested in seemed to be getting to the roots of problems in far many more ways than the federal government were. I am excited that there's openings now in the government where there are hearings on agribusiness, for example. The Department of Justice is holding hearings on agribusiness that really they haven't had before. There's an interest in promoting local and sustainable farming from within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Again, it's been a long time since we've seen that sort of support. Also, regulators are suddenly getting funding again, so we can have a slightly safer food system. I'm encouraged by that. But in the main, these are improvements that needed to happen, that have been underfunded for the past decade, but they don't quite go far enough. And a lot of people are looking to, for example, the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act, a bill for school meals in the United States that ensures that every kid gets to eat as part of our commitment to our citizens. To make sure that the kids don't go hungry is one of the primary responsibilities of a country, particularly as rich as this. And another thing that I'm interested in, and I think that we're seeing a lot of interesting organization around, is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill was passed in the dying years of the Bush administration with full Democrat support. And what a lot of people are saying is, well, maybe what we need is not a farm bill, but a food bill. Michael Pollan has been saying something along these lines, and a lot of organizers have been pushing for something like that to happen. So I think in the next iteration of the Farm Bill, which will happen in 3 years' time, we need to be looking not to renew the Department of Agriculture, but thinking about a U.S. Department of Food, because that would certainly transform the way that we eat, that we grow, that we share our food. Yes, the agribusiness would lose out of that, but I think every U.S. citizen would gain.
In the meantime, is there anything the U.S. President could do using the bully pulpit of his office to advance the discussion on this issue?
Well, I certainly think that using the bully pulpit to talk about sustainability, and to some extent, climate change has taken second row to healthcare, and food is way behind that. But actually, food is about healthcare. Food is about climate change. If we're interested in a healthy population, then we need to be tackling diabetes. 1 in 5 healthcare dollars in this country is spent taking care of someone with diabetes. That's a food issue. And if we're serious about genuine healthcare reform, then we need to be thinking about the food system. And if we're thinking about climate change, about an agriculture that is light on water and oil, we also need to be thinking about transforming the way our food system works. I'd like the President to be talking a lot more about how to join the dots rather than succumbing a little to the Washington agenda of one bill, one bill, one bill, when in fact what we need is an overarching politics that explains why we need healthcare reform, why we need climate change reform, why we need reform in the food system. And I think that overarching politics is something, no matter where you're coming from, has been lacking in this President's approach. We haven't really got a sense of what his doctrine is. And I think that given what I understand of his interests in food and climate change and everything else, the doctrine really ought to be enunciated more clearly and with food and social justice really at its heart.
Now, what is the likelihood of that happening? And the reason I'm asking is many people are frustrated with what they see as the lack of progress on so many issues. They see good intentions, they see a lot of talk, but they don't see as much progress as they had hoped for at this stage.
Well, I think that's really a question about expectations. I mean, I was very pleased on the night that Senator Obama was elected, but the morning after the hangover sort of dissipated, it became very clear that he was a centrist president, and it became very interestingly one of the biggest groups that saw this coming and saw the disappointments coming was within the food community, where when he announced the appointment of Tom Vilsack as the Secretary for Agriculture. Vilsack is a kind of an agribusiness insider. And this was before President Obama became President Obama. He'd announced that Vilsack was going to be his Secretary for Agriculture, and it was immensely disappointing. So, I mean, in many ways, there are no rose-tinted glasses in the food movement expecting this to happen. Nonetheless, the shift that we've seen in the President this year, getting a little bit more sort of belligerent, and not trying to be the sort of mild-mannered go-between is, I mean, to some extent encouraging. I'm not sure that he's quite reached the place where he needs to be. But I'm a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will. And so I can see plenty of reasons why the President might not embrace a doctrine that actually would help secure his name in the history books. But on the other hand, I'm hopeful that he will, because if a cold hard look at where everything from healthcare to climate change is going, which ought to make clear that partisanship isn't, there's not going to be any bipartisan solution here, and that really what is needed is rather than the President being the sort of frustrated civil servant, he needs to be a leader in many more ways than he has been, and I think there are some signs that he might be embracing that role.
Moving from the commander-in-chief down to the grassroots level, what are some of the things that people in their communities could do to advance this discussion? Does there need to be more pressure from the bottom up, or are there other things people might do, literally taking this into their own hands at the local level to make a difference? Well,
absolutely. I mean, I certainly think shopping smarter is a good thing to do, because shopping more stupidly is generally a bad idea. But shopping smarter, buying locally, ensuring that the goods that you buy are, in fact, produced environmentally and socially sustainably. And at the moment, there's a campaign involving the Publix chain of supermarkets and their desire not to do the same thing as McDonald's and a range of other corporations, and ensuring that farm workers are paid a decent living wage. That's a campaign that's ongoing and live, and people can join in right here in Florida. And so, if going to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers website, something that people can do right now. But I think that's important, right? I mean, shopping smarter is really about the first step in something much bigger and much more fruitful, which is embracing the fact that one is not merely a consumer, one is a citizen. And when you embrace the fact that you're a citizen, all of a sudden there's way more that you can do, and it's actually much more fulfilling to do it. So getting involved in your church group to say, well, why do we have hunger? Martin Luther King was saying towards the end of his life that he'd been called upon to serve the beggars in life's marketplace. But when you ask why it is that the hungry are produced by this system, you need to realize that change needs to be made. And so getting involved in a political way, demanding support for working families, demanding a living wage so that everyone can afford to eat. These are political interventions that actually are not very far off. Churches, labor groups, a range of organizations in the state that really cares about what working Americans have to face every day are already organizing around this. And it doesn't take much to just Google and jump in.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that is of interest to you, I'm guessing, from your past involvement in lots of community organizations.
Well, that's right. But also, the fact that I am now a citizen in this country, I feel like I do care about what happens to this country. I love this country. I wouldn't have become a citizen if I did not care very deeply for it. And I do think that the kinds of community organizing that I'm seeing give me a great deal of hope in terms of what can be achieved. But it's all important to remember that democracy never trickles down. It always bubbles up. And change. The federal government is in many ways in the pockets of big business, and we ought not to be deluded about that. But also, it's a chance to remember that the government is of the people and by the people, and we can make it for the people again.
Mm-hmm. What's next for you? Do you have a book project in the works, or some other research project that is of interest to you?
For me, food is always kind of a central issue. But there are lots of ways in which thinking about food sort of cashes out. And for me, I'm in the process of doing some research in Malawi with some colleagues there, looking at how we are going to feed the world in the future. And Malawi has been touted as a place where the food system is working very well because they have access to fertilizer and in many ways a sort of Potemkin village. But I was there in December, and as soon as I landed, there were huge queues for gasoline. And it turns out that in order for the Malawi miracle and its fertilizer to be bought, all the money that was going to be used to buy petrol and to buy oil was spent on fertilizer instead. It's important firstly to point out that the miracle is no such thing. But it's also important to point out that despite all that, in Malawi there's some really exciting stuff happening, the real miracles happening on the ground. And I'm doing some research and reporting on that that I'll hopefully be able to share later on this year.
And so if some miracles are happening on the ground there and some good things are happening on the ground in the United States, are you optimistic during the longer term about prospects for improvement?
I don't know. Sometimes I have some very dark thoughts about how well the world is doing. It's very clear that we're already in the Anthropocene age, the age, as the historian Mike Davis puts it, of mass extinctions, of where our existence on this planet has eliminated the existence of many other species. We're already seeing, 300,000 people die a year from climate change right now. This isn't some kooky conspiracy. This is the data that we have at the moment. Things are pretty bad. But I do think that if we sort of surrender and wave a white flag, we sell ourselves and our children short. And I just became a father. I'm not ready to leave my son a world that's so denuded that there's nothing left for him to live in.
Mm-hmm. In closing, is there a piece of advice you could offer to listeners today that might inspire them to become involved or to think more deeply about this topic?
Well, I think that in many ways we've been denied the right to be Democrats, not big D Democrats, but just citizens. We've been denied the right to do that. We're encouraged and said to shop smarter, vote once every couple of years, and then don't worry our pretty little heads about politics. But actually, the way that we reclaim power, the way that we actually become happier people, as I suggest in the new book, in The Value of Nothing, is actually through community engagement. And so, the liberating idea is for us not to become consumers, but to realize that we are citizens and that we've got work to do to maintain our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Is there a website that listeners might visit if they're interested in learning more about your work?
Sure. rajpatel.org is the place where I blog and I put up articles and have links to a lot of organizations that I'm inspired by.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.